Good afternoon for the fourth and final time this afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Coffer-Bush. I'm co-director of the Center for American Studies, and it's been quite a day here with our annual conference on America's founding principles in history, focusing on civil discourse and civil disagreement. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our last speaker of the day, last but not least. And I'm especially excited to have Dr. Wright here because I learned of him through my co-author. They actually work together at the University of Kentucky. So it's been a great experience getting to know him over the last day. George C. Wright is a distinguished university research professor and senior advisor to the president of the University of Kentucky. He's a Lexington native and earned his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Kentucky and a PhD in history from Duke University. I assure you it's merely coincidental we have two professors from Duke University. He has held leadership roles at institutions such as Prairie View and A&M University, where he served as president, and the University of Texas at Arlington, where he was executive vice president and provost. So clearly he went to the dark side somewhere in his academic career. An accomplished scholar of African American history and race relations, Dr. Wright has authored several books, including Racial Violence in Kentucky from 1865 to 1940. His work has earned numerous awards, including Duke's Distinguished Alumni Award and an honorary doctorate of letters from the University of Kentucky. And he's going to speak on the topic of constitutional betrayal and constitutional redemption from 1864 to 1964. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Wright.
Good afternoon. I hope all of you can hear me. We have a microphone on. It's indeed a pleasure to be here. Every time I've had an opportunity to either teach a class, even though she was mentioning that I was a college administrator, I was actually a college professor for many years at the University of Kentucky, at Duke University, were the two places that I taught over the years. In every class that I've ever taught, and then today at this program turned out the same, I probably learn far more from students, from other people than I give to them. And I have no doubt this will be the case as well. So I thank you all for being here today. As was mentioned, the title of my presentation is Constitutional Betrayal, Constitutional Redemption, 1865-1964. It's a course that a colleague and I developed. His name is Bill Throw. Bill Throw was actually legal counsel here at Christopher Newport before coming to the University of Kentucky. I came back to the University of Kentucky in 2019 after I retired from being a college president for 14 years. And Bill Throw and I, 3 years ago, we developed two courses. The first course that we teach every fall is called The British Crown, the U.S. Constitution, and Slavery. We talk about slavery in that context. And then the second course that we teach every spring for the last 3 years picks up right after that. And that's the class that we're talking about, that I'll be talking about this afternoon. In that course and in this presentation, I reference, though I use a number of other primary sources, and Bill Throw uses a lot of legal documents, and I use some legal documents as well, but I do rely on the three books on race relations that I wrote on Kentucky, as well as the articles. Every time I ever mention my books, I always then say, surely you all have read my books on race relations in Kentucky. I always get a smile from that. Or I guess there's someone who could have read my books and they keep it a secret. My son, when he was a junior in college at the University of Texas in San Antonio, he was taking a Southern history class, and they used my book on racial violence in Kentucky. And my son would not tell the professor that I was his father, you see. So my own son kept reading my book a secret. It's important that I mention that because of the context of the research that I've done, because if you do an assessment of Kentucky's history. Let's say you look at the vast majority of white scholars who've written about Kentucky's past, historians. You look at newspaper editors. You look at a lot of observers at any point in Kentucky's past, from slavery down to the present. A comment that was often made, and one of the themes that these Kentucky scholars and then national scholars would pick up on was that race relations in Kentucky, the interactions between whites and blacks at any time period, slavery, Reconstruction, the present, whatever the present was at that point, were far better in Kentucky. That African Americans received a much milder form of treatment from whites in Kentucky than was the case in the South, and they said in many places in the North as well. That race relations in Kentucky, they often argued, were almost idyllic, and that black people were treated fairly and humanely. If you were to read my 3 books and my articles, you would see that my conclusion of race relations differs with that. Here's something to keep in mind in talking about those things, is that if you look at Kentucky, slavery, of course, ends in 1865, but if you look at Kentucky, 1870 to the present, every decade, the black population in Kentucky would decline. They would be a smaller percentage of the total population in the state of Kentucky. To where, let's say by the year 1900, black people comprise 12% of Kentucky's population. But if you were to take out Louisville and Lexington, the 2 largest cities in Kentucky, the percentage of blacks would be even smaller. Now, why is that significant? Because you see, further south, take almost any of the southern states, especially the period 1800 to 1930, the black population was at least a third, if not 40%, and maybe even in a couple of states, Mississippi and South Carolina, they bordered on being 50% of the population. In those states, whites would often say, without any real basis, nevertheless, that they feared Negro domination, that black people were a third to almost 50%. Well, that absurd claim could not be made in Kentucky, where black people were 12% or less of the population in the state. When you look at the concept of constitutional betrayal, we start with the period immediately after the Civil War. And if you think about the 4 million African Americans, and then there were another 500,000 free blacks in the South, and then there were some 400 to 500,000 free blacks in the North. Well, when you think about those people, but let's say the ex-slaves, what did they want to do immediately after slavery? Well, one of the first things they wanted to do was to unite, get their families back together. Many of their families, of course, had been separated under slavery. The ex-slaves were seeking employment opportunities. Above all, the ex-slaves wanted an education for themselves and even more so for their children. They were looking for a new start in life. They also created, I'm sure in this area, in Lexington where I grew up, in Kentucky and so forth, they created churches, social clubs, and the like. In other words, here's what they were doing, and think about this. This is without any severance pay, right? That they were given nothing but the clothes on their back when slavery ended. So this is what they were doing. Does it sound like Negro domination? Does it sound like a real threat? Meanwhile, whites in both the North and the South were also asking the question. But here's the question, and interestingly, I smiled earlier today when one of the other speakers said it. just like it was said back then. Back then, 1865, Northern whites, Southern whites said, quote, "What should we do with the Negro?" Unquote. That was the burning question. They asked the question and then they quickly answered the question. And in answering the question, even though the North and the South had been involved in this bitter war for 4 years that took almost the lives of a million people, my colleague Bill Thoreau said the other day to our class, he said, put it into a context, if the population of the United States back then was the population that it is now, some 10 million Americans would have been killed during the Civil War. Even though they had had this bitter Civil War, both Northerners and Southerners agreed that black people were inferior to white people. That even though they may argue that whether or not slavery should go on, but the Civil War had answered that, they did agree that black people should not be made their equals in the new world. A scholar by the name of C. Van Woodward said, Northerners and Southerners may have disagreed on a lot of things, but not on this fundamental belief that African Americans were not their equal. But check this out, making conditions all the worse for African Americans in Kentucky in the period of Reconstruction was a basic fact. There had been 4 loyal states that had remained in the Union, and while the Freedmen's Bureau and some Reconstruction Acts would apply to them, these 4 loyal states, Maryland, Missouri, Delaware, Kentucky, and especially Kentucky, were freer in handling the quote-unquote Negro problem than was the case further south. What does that mean? In some of the reconstructed states, they were compelled to vote in favor of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. Kentucky's legislature voted against the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. Now, there's someone here who would say, but Dr. Wright, you do know in the 1970s, Kentucky looked at that and said, you know what? That just doesn't look good. So 100 years later, they voted again and passed the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. But they did not then. Back then in the 1860s, they voted, and 1870s, they voted against them. They also started creating Confederate monuments and memorials. Go to any Kentucky community. Kentucky has 120 counties. I bet you there is a Confederate symbol in every one of those. The names of the schools in Lexington, Kentucky, Dixie Plantation, so on down the line, all of those kind of things would be a part of my childhood growing up there. So much so that so many people born in the decades after the Civil War thought erroneously that Kentucky had been a part of the Confederacy. They would be told proudly, no, we did not fight with the Confederacy, but we joined it as quickly as we could after the Civil War. So in other words, whites in Kentucky were free to handle the Negro problem. Well, that's during Reconstruction. We next talk about this period, the 1870s. My colleagues earlier today talked about once the South was quote unquote redeemed, and let's say that's 1876. Well, a scholar by the name of Rayford Logan, he was an African American who taught history at Howard University. He wrote a book called The Nadir, The Lowest Point, The Betrayal of the Negro. And so a lot of scholars in my field use that term, the nadir, to say that the absolute worst period of race relations, and I realize it's a relative comment, occurs in the period after Reconstruction, i.e., let's say 1880s to 1930. This is the time when, according to Dr. Rayford Logan and other scholars, when the government seemed to turn its back on African Americans. One example, of course, and again, it was talked about earlier today, was segregation laws. Now, segregation itself was not new, but the intensity of how it occurred in the time. I went to Duke University, but a very outstanding place to do Southern history. It's 12 miles away, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And an outstanding scholar, when I was a student at Duke, was a man named Joel Williamson, a professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who wrote a book called The Crucible of Race, Black-White Relations in the American South. Professor Williamson said there was a proliferation of segregation laws during this period. He said, again, this is not new. He said, but the intent of Southerners and Americans wanted to make sure these things were legalized, and at the same time, they wanted everyone to know that this is being done because the Negro is an inferior person. So he said, not only are they to be kept out, they're to be told by everyone that they're to be kept out. So I like to tell my students, if you think about it, during this period, segregation laws would exist to the extent of people's imaginations. And so you go on. And of course, this would be capped off with 1896 with the case of Plessy versus Ferguson that said separate but equal. Kentucky would pass its version of these laws, and so would other states as well. But that's not the only thing that's occurred. By the time the Supreme Court rules in 1896 on Plessy versus Ferguson, the court had already ruled in 1890 in Williams versus Mississippi. Mississippi, prior to coming up with this disfranchisement law, actually had more black voters than white voters, but the result was to strip blacks of voting in Mississippi. The Supreme Court, constitutional betrayal, upholds this. I should have mentioned, I apologize, that there was one dissenter in the Plessy case. His name was John Marshall Harlan, a Kentuckian whose father had been a slaveholder. And John Marshall Harlan would dissent in the Plessy case, and he also would write a famous dissent in the Berea, Kentucky College case. Berea College was one of two colleges, private schools that was integrated at this time. In 1903, Kentucky passed a law outlawing blacks from this private college. Marshall Harlan dissented there. Well, by the time this happened, the Supreme Court had also passed these laws disfranchising black voters as well. But the nadir period did not stop there. Scholars in my discipline talk about the nadir period as either the high point, if you will, or the low point, if you will, whichever way you would rather say that, of lynchings in America. They point out this period, 1880 to 1930, and they say it's the heyday of lynchings. Some 4,000 people were lynched in the United States. Scholars say if you divide it by days, every other day someone was lynched in America. Now, the reason they call this period, 1880 to 1930, the heyday or the low point of lynching, is because it's during that time that white newspapers started covering it in great detail, led by the Chicago Tribune, that they started keeping a catalog on lynchings and the like. Booker T. Washington School, Tuskegee, also cataloged it. Under this listing of 4,000 people lynched, my state, Kentucky, ranks 10th, and scholars say there were some 200 people lynched in Kentucky during that time. I decided, however, to write a book on racial violence in Kentucky, And I then went to Washington, D.C., to the to the National Archives, Record Group 105, and starting with Reconstruction, and I was able to document a number of lynchings there. I also then would travel to a great portion of Kentucky's 120 counties, and I would read what the local newspaper said and a number of other things. Here's what I discovered. My book has in Appendix A a list of 353, not 200 lynchings that occurred in Kentucky. I also showed the reader that I throw out some lynchings because I want people to see my work as being credible. Furthermore, in my book, I showed that some 50% of all the lynchings that occurred in Kentucky actually occurred in the 15-year period, 1865 to 1880, before the time period that most people have documented. I wonder if scholars went back to 1865, how many lynchings would they find for Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas in that regard? So really, they start counting lynchings in 1880. So my work shows how many lynchings occurred earlier. In Kentucky, 75% of the people lynched were African Americans in a state where they were 12% of the population. If time permitted, I could give you examples of lynching that you would say, no, you made a mistake. You really meant Mississippi, Alabama, Texas. A famous or infamous lynching, 1899, Maysville, Kentucky, of a young man by the name of Richard Coleman. Allegedly, we don't know if he really did it or not, rape and murder. They announced in the newspaper for a week that he would be lynched. They brought him in on a wagon. He was burned at the stake in one very similar that Joel Wilson talks about that happened in Paris, Texas in 1893. I have any number of other lynchings. There's a lynching in a place called Livermore, Kentucky in 1912 that I say is unique in the history of lynchings because they decided to take the person from the jailhouse and put him in the opera house. And so just think about if this was the opera house in Livermore, Kentucky, they put the person here on the stage, and those of you sitting in the first 3 or 4 rows, you paid more than the folks sitting back there. You could shoot your pistol when they said go in this regard. That lynching was covered by a Paris, France newspaper, and so forth. But I also talk about the lynching of 4 youths, and the picture of that is in the Library of Congress and other places in a place called Russellville, Kentucky, and they had done absolutely nothing, but it was done as a warning to other folk in that regard. So first part of my book under the nadir period is on lynchings. I talk about another phenomenon that occurred in the Deep South that also occurred in Kentucky, mob rule, where African Americans are told that they can no longer live in certain places in Kentucky. And guess what? The case was that some of those African Americans coming out of slavery had cobbled their money together and had purchased land. So lo and behold, their farmland, their animals are taken away from them. But the one I talk about most was it occurred in 1919 when in a railroad community where some 200 blacks were working, a place called Corbin, Kentucky, all of the blacks were forced to leave, and as late as yesterday, or maybe this week, no one black lives in Corbin. When I was growing up in Kentucky, there was a sign that said, "Don't be here when the sun goes down." Again, you see these things in Florida, you see these things in Mississippi, these things existed in Kentucky as well. So mob rule existed. I also talk about the third aspect of racial violence, and that is, quote unquote, legal lynchings. In Kentucky, some 229 people have been legally executed over the years. Again, African Americans, comprising what, less than 12% of the population, were 75, 80% of the people who were legally executed in Kentucky. Every person who's ever been executed in Kentucky was convicted by an all-white jury. No one African American served on those juries in that regard. A large number of them were executed for rape. No white man in Kentucky, or in the South has ever been executed for the rape of a black woman. In the history of the United States of America, the rape of a black woman has essentially been a non-crime. But it definitely was the case in Kentucky. I talk about legal lynchings as replacing the mob in Kentucky because in a lot of instances, a person was arrested and told that if he pleads guilty, he will be given a quick trial and then executed. You might say, well, why do that? Well, at least the mob would not cut your fingers off or burn you at the stake. So many African Americans were found guilty of a crime and executed on the same day that Kentucky in 1909 came up with a 30-day cooling off law, but it was ignored anyway in that regard. So in my book, I talk about the number of legal lynchings that occurred. I asked under the concept of constitutional betrayal, when did legal lynchings end in Kentucky? I can pretty much document when lynchings by the mob ended, but when did legal lynchings, when did the courts come in and do something about it? In 1937, in a case called Hale versus Paducah, the United States Supreme Court said something has to be done because no one black has ever served on a felony trial in the state of Kentucky. This is 1937. 50 years later, 1986, the United States in a case called Baston versus Louisville said something has to be done because lawyers in Louisville, the most enlightened place in Kentucky, are using their preemptive challenges to prevent blacks from serving on juries. So as late as 1986, black people in Kentucky were not serving on felony cases. And so constitutional betrayal was still continuing at least that late. I could go on with other examples of constitutional betrayal, but I concluded that legal lynchings was the most brutal form of violence that African Americans in Kentucky and the South experienced, far more than the lynchings at the mob's hand. Why? Because these legal lynchings carried the law with them, and it made people believe that they had actually been fair in giving African Americans a trial before they executed them. The second part of the course that Bill Throw and I teach, of course, talks about constitutional redemption. Some of the presentations earlier today, in fact, one of my colleagues earlier today said that black protests, black resistance, the civil rights movement started even before the American Revolutionary War, when African Americans started petitioning for their freedom and so forth. So clearly, whatever date you say about civil rights, about asking for redress, it is probably an arbitrary date. What I like to say to my students is that in 1908, there was a riot in Springfield, Illinois, the hometown of Abraham Lincoln. And this race riot, there had been a whole series of race riots that had occurred elsewhere, primarily in the South, But with this race riot occurring in the North, a white liberal, Wm. English Walling, wrote a column saying that the race war is being transformed to the North. And he said it's time for white people to stand up and say no more. Well, Wm. English Walling's call led to the start of an interracial organization, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Now, when I think about constitutional redemption, there are a lot of things I could say. I could talk about black soldiers in World War I, where W.E.B. Du Bois, there was a debate among blacks as to whether or not they should join the fight in World War I. Du Bois, the black intellectual, said, if we close ranks now and support our government during the wartime, well, surely we will be given certain rights after the war. Well, that did not occur. But you can look at some other things, but clearly the NAACP, in its infancy in the 1910s, started doing some litigation that would be very important. One was they challenged the start of a movie, The Birth of a Nation. The Birth of a Nation depicted Reconstruction as a time when black people dominated the governments and passed all sorts of incredibly stupid legislation and so on down the line. It was bad enough that the movie existed, but people would often go from the movie into the black community and attack African Americans. Well, the NAACP tried to work against that. The NAACP even won a victory before the Supreme Court from Louisville, Kentucky, the 1917 Residential Segregation Ordinance. But clearly, under the concept of constitutional redemption, was something that the NAACP did beginning in 1929. In 1929, the NAACP received some money from an anonymous, everything suggests, white donor who said, if you could come up with a plan that would really make America be what it is, a place for everyone, that this person would give $100,000 to the NAACP. Well, the NAACP held a meeting in Asheville, North Carolina, and they invited in a number of professors. Today here, we've heard from law professors and the like. A law professor from Yale University, a Jewish professor named Nathan Margot, gave a presentation. And Nathan Margot said, if you think about the legal system, and especially the Supreme Court, here's the law here, Plessy versus Ferguson. They're not likely to change Plessy versus Ferguson overnight, separate but equal, but you have to find a way to chip away at Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson is based on separate but equal. And even though you could look at two different institutions, if you look at the institution, I was president of Prairie View A&M University under the Reconstruction government that Texas faced in 1876. Texas started Texas A&M University and Prairie View A&M University. They started on the same day, but if you go look in the records, almost everyone will tell you that Prairie View started second and A&M started first, but under the law, they had to start the same day. The University of Texas at Austin, where I was a professor for 13 years, Texas A&M, and Prairie View, where I was president for 14 years, they are 3 of 35 public universities in the state of Texas. Only those 3 share something called the Permanent University Fund. That fund generates today's dollars. So go back to the 1890s. They share something like $700 million a year, okay? So the University of Texas gets about $500 million, and Prairie View and Texas A&M split about $350 million. Under separate but equal, down to the present. Texas A&M gets about 300 million. Prairie View gets about 20 million. You look at all of the other schools in the Texas A&M system, they came into existence on the money from Prairie View, you see. So Nathan Margot said, where things are definitely not equal is that Prairie View does not have a law school. Prairie View does not have a vet school, and so on, excuse me, down the line. And so they developed a strategy that they would attack at the college graduate and professional level. And all of you probably know about the case in Missouri and so forth. This strategy was adopted in 1930, and the NAACP selects its leader. The leader who would fight these battles for 20 years was a man by the name of Charles Hamilton Houston, and his main lieutenant was a man by the name of Thurgood Marshall. They go state after state, some victories and so forth. One of the most important days in the whole history of the civil rights movement occurs in February 1950, when the U.S. Supreme Court rules, number one, in the case of Sweat versus Painter, on the desegregation of the University of Texas Law School, and says that the black person has to be admitted to the University of Texas Law School. And then in McLaurin versus Oklahoma, said that the black person had to be admitted to the University of Oklahoma's graduate program. After that, they continue some, but they then go back from where in 1947, they had started working in Clarendon County, South Carolina. They had started working in Delaware. They had started working here in Virginia. They had started working in Topeka, Kansas. They had come up with 4 cases that they then put together that they wanted to take before the Supreme Court. At the last minute, a 5th case comes in from Washington, D.C. The Thurgood Marshall did not want to take this. Interestingly, after 1950, after those 2 college cases, Charles Hamilton Houston dies of a heart attack, excuse me. And so Thurgood Marshall takes them over. As you then know, it is in May the 17th, 1954, that the Supreme Court, listening to some of the arguments that John Marshall Harlan had said decades earlier, rules in favor of Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP. What most people forget, however, is that the Supreme Court said this is so momentous that we want everybody to think about this and come back a year later with how this can be implemented. The court then made its second ruling on May the 31st, 1955, and that is the one we live under. In the second Brown decision, it said, with all deliberate speed. With all deliberate speed meant that school integration occurred in Louisville, Kentucky. With all deliberate speed is it Prince Edward County, Virginia, or Prince George's County. I apologize, I know it, I'm supposed to say it. You all want to take some of my credit away for me not saying it correctly. Whichever one, they closed the schools from 1958 to 1963, right? They said, and I always said that their view was that we're gonna make sure white kids are dumb, but black folk are dumber. That'll make us feel really good in that regard there. But all deliberate speed, Brown 2, was a setback for Thurgood Marshall. But nevertheless, our course ends with 1964 and the passing of the Civil Rights Act, which in essence would give black people all of the rights that white people have. As I now close, I must tell you, I grew up in Kentucky, and all my life I've attended Black Baptist churches, and when folks say, as I close, they don't really mean they're closing. It's just to kind of keep you interested. And normally when the minister says that's another 30 minutes, well, I'm not going to do that. But I was thinking about the title of this program, Civil Discourse, Civil Disobedience, and how these are ideas that are very important to what I've always believed in. An idea number one that I think of mine that fits in really good is remembrance. I believe that one of the major problems in the country that we live in today is that we have chosen not to remember our past, that we don't really want to remember slavery, Reconstruction, and all of those kinds of things. The problem is that when an incident happens, like Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and people say they want to sit down and now talk about race, that's the worst time to have a conversation about race. It's far better to have a conversation ongoing. I truly believe that if we had ongoing conversations where we really talked about our past, it would be far better. I also believe everybody's voice needs to be heard. Whatever your viewpoint, you are entitled to it. This week is the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz concentration camp. In 1985, my wife, who is a journalist, and we went to Nuremberg, Germany. That was the first time we'd ever been out of the United States. Technically, it was West Germany back then. My brother was a captain in the army there. He took us to Munich, and we went to Dachau concentration camp. And in Dachau concentration camp, it said, we must never forget. It didn't say we must extract revenge. It said we must never forget. And so I, a scholar of Afro-American history, decided I needed to learn more about the Jewish experience in the concentration camp. And so beginning in 1987, for the next 10 years, every summer, my wife and I would go somewhere in Europe and visit concentration camps. We capped it off by spending 2 weeks in Poland, spending time in Warsaw, in Krakow, seeing Auschwitz ourselves, and so forth. But we didn't stop there. When in Germany, when in Berlin, when they opened a concentration, or a memorial there to the victims of the Holocaust. We went there in 2017. We went to Buenos Aires, Argentina, to see their memorial to the Jews and so forth. In 2018, it dawned on us that we had not been to Vienna, Austria, and the concentration camp there. That we tried to do all of this just so, and we've been to places in Eastern Europe, things like that, so that we could have an understanding, because we must remember, well, just as much as we need to remember what happened to people in the Holocaust, we need to remember what happened to people in this country. So remembrance is very important to me. In the last presentation, Nelson Mandela's name was evoked. My wife and I have been very fortunate. We've been to South Africa 4 or 5 different times to try to understand what happened with Nelson Mandela and learn about his whole thing there. We spent time in Durban, South Africa, understanding Gandhi, that type of thing, but clearly going to Cape Town, South Africa on several occasions. What stands out in my mind so much is that after being over 20 years in prison, Nelson Mandela talked about reconciling as an important way of moving forward. So reconciling is something that's very important to me, as well as a concept. Remember, reconcile, and so forth are very important. Then there's another concept that you talked about that I really is important to me, and I'm not so sure a lot of people appreciate this one today, is I like to remind people of progress along the way. As I look around this room, I'm probably the oldest person in this room. I'm a baby boomer. I was born on W.E.B. Du Bois's birthday. So what birthday is that? Come on, someone say it real quickly. When is W.E.B. Du Bois's birthday? February 23rd. I like to tell my students, and I told them this semester, and it's not true, and I know you shouldn't tell students things that's not true, but I tell my students that my mother was in labor on February the 22nd, but she just held on so I could be born on the 23rd. You know that's not true, right? But at any rate, I really do believe if you look at the world that I was born into in 1950, my father-in-law and my father were both drafted into the military at age 17. They come back home to Lexington after the war, and there are German prisoners of war who can go into places in Lexington that my father and my father-in-law cannot go into. When I was a young person in Lexington, I could not eat in the downtown restaurants or go into places. I used to say to my mother, and she would get so annoyed, we're going to say, don't say it this time. I'd say it anyway. I say, Mama, what do white people do in bathrooms that black folk don't do? What do they do? I need to go in there and see what white folk do in that regard. I grew up in that world, but guess what? By being born in 1950 meant that the world changed, you see. That lo and behold, by the time I'm a teenager, school integration has occurred. And lo and behold, in 1960, my teacher takes us to the University of Kentucky. We go across their campus and people mocked at us. But a few years later, they were welcomed at UK. To show you how much, and I apologize if it sounds like I'm bragging, please, it's not. There is not an honor that the University of Kentucky gives alums that UK has not given me over the years, right? I have received everything. I've asked UK more recently since I worked for the president. I said, why don't you all give me a basketball scholarship? It's the only thing I'm missing. They won't give it to me. Okay, in that regard. Now, does that mean everything has changed? Or to look at it another way, think about in the world that we live in, we've had an African-American president, we've had a woman of color as vice president. Is that not progress? You might quickly say, but yeah, but look at all of the pushback and all those kind of things. So here's what I like to say. There has been progress along the way. Here's 1950 when I was born. Here's 2025. The world is not perfect, but I tell you what, when I was born in 1950, people were not believing what they did. Now, finally at last, okay, when a black minister says finally at last, I'm not a black minister, but I've now said, as I conclude for the second time, the last idea I like to share with people is that for those of you who are students here at Christopher Newport, those of us who've been fortunate in life to have opportunities, what are we supposed to do about it? Because here's what I didn't say. In 1968, April the 4th, Martin Luther King was assassinated. I'm a senior in high school, but I've not done anything in high school. I'm mad at the world, right? I've made all D's and C's. Whose fault is that? My fault in that regard. But King is assassinated. The University of Kentucky said it was going to come up with a program for Negro youths who graduated that summer, that if you come out to UK and take simulated college courses, you would be given a Martin Luther King scholarship as long as you could make a B average. Now, I ain't never made a B, so how am I going to do that? But nevertheless, I go out there. My future wife is out there, as well as other folk. The third day, they told everyone to bring their transcript, and they said, everybody can leave but George Wright. I said, darn. I'm saying darn now. I said, damn, back then. I apologize here in saying that. And I said, what's the problem? They said, we looked at your grades. This is an embarrassment. I said, I know, but I can do it. I've just been mad. They said, okay, but we can't give you a Martin Luther King scholarship. It would be too embarrassing even to King. But guess what? They gave me money, and 9 years later, I had a PhD from Duke University, and the world opened up to me to where I'm now in my 70s, and things are still. So I'm talking about, what does all that mean? I'll close by saying this. I'll use a scripture. The Bible talks about unto those who've been given things, you've got to do something. John, the 4th chapter, the 37th and 38th verses says, "'Tis true that some sow and others reap. I sent you to reap where you did not sow. Others did the work, but you received the harvest." You know what that means for me? I did not take part in any civil rights demonstration. I was never had coffee thrown on me. No one ever called me a name. There were other people who endured all of those indignities and hardships and so forth. I get to walk through the door behind those people. So what am I supposed to do about that? I would say the same thing to you. What are you going to do because you benefited from the good deeds of other people? I thank you for your time.
We have a few minutes for questions, if there are any questions.
So you mentioned allowing space for all opinions.
Yes.
What if an opinion perpetuates violence or anything of that nature?
Okay.
Like take this is a really easy example, but violent Nazis.
Okay. I really, obviously, universities, I'm going to say in a university environment, and I would say here, there are certain things you cannot say. Like in this room right now, I cannot say a fire is about to happen. If a fire is not happening, that would not be allowed. I'm not a lawyer. There's some lawyers in here. I don't know if one of you stood up and said, "I want you to now hit someone or do something like that." I don't know if you could say that. But the fact that you might say you are a Nazi and you believe the ideas, the things I just mentioned about going to the concentration camp, if someone just got up and said that none of that existed, it's all a fabrication and all that, I guess they would have the right to say that. But I guess I'm probably waffling on you when it comes to that. We would have to protect the right of others. But you know what? My colleague, whose name I said at the beginning, Bill Throw, he and I got together at Kentucky from the beginning because we talk about with free speech also goes responsibility. That you see, maybe I do have the right to say certain things, but should I say certain things? And there are certain things I should not say to you or about you and so forth. So in my class, the class that I just talked about, the very first day, I say to my students, we're going to be talking about race, and I'm going to make the statement that I made to you. I make that statement about white men have raped black women and nothing's ever been done. But what about the other way around? But I said, but here's what I want. I said, the terms that seem to be acceptable in talking about white people is to use the term white or Caucasian. There are some derogatory terms you could use for them. I would rather you not use those derogatory terms. And the same thing I said about black people are women folk. I've never had a student then to say those terms that except when quoting or something like that. But I guess, young man, if someone did, I would have to allow them to say those terms, even though it would hurt me. You know what? When I was growing up, didn't they say sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt you? My words can hurt. That those of us who've been educated, we probably have the vocabulary to say some things that really are hurtful. But I hope in this presentation I didn't say anything that was hurtful to anybody. I love humor. I tell jokes all day. You all didn't really laugh when I said the joke about my son. I'm saying, what is wrong with this? That's funny. Or something like that. But I'm not going to make a joke about women. I'm not going to make a joke. I don't even make a joke about the president or those kind of folks. I just have to find another way. So I don't know, I probably, do one of you law professors want to answer the young man's question? Because I don't know if somebody said they were coming to the University of Kentucky and they're going to advocate violence. I would think UK would say, no, we're not going to have that. What would they say, John?
You can't advocate for women's law training. And I would add, or at university,
Oh.
that's not up for discussion. I guess I was referring more to like a public domain, like say, once again, part of one, not they're not necessarily saying let's go have commit X violent act, but more so perpetuating a hateful but we know historically when Nazis gather, violence follows suit. So even if they are not directly gathering for violence, we know that historically it will more than likely happen. So should we even allow that as a possibility?
Right, yeah, so under the current law, we do allow it, and then you're asking the normative question, should we allow it? It's a great question. I mean, I'm generally a free speech absolutist, but I also think there are pretty good arguments. In Germany, for example, they outlaw the Nazi Party.
Absolutely.
So could you say, here are 3 groups that we're not going to allow in this country? I think that's plausible.
Earlier today, one of the speakers spoke to programs on college campuses where people have come to disrupt and all those things. Maybe folks see the world differently than me, but I mentioned legal lynchings, legal executions, and even today there are instances, and there are not very many executions that occur here, where some people get to witness those. Well, if folks said someone was going to be publicly executed in Lexington, Kentucky, at a certain time, you all would then say, George Wright will not be there. You all can bet on that. You can absolutely bet. If the Klan or someone was coming through the University of Kentucky, you can say, George Wright will not be there. Why not stay away? Why not just ignore certain people is what I do. I don't dignify. Have you all, and here's one of the things about growing up black for me. And by the way, and again, you all ought to smile when I say this. I used to tell my students, you know what? Everybody ought to be black for a little while, maybe a week. And then I said, okay, for an hour, be black. Okay. And just this. But one of the things in my life, I've been in situations where I've heard people say some things that are very uncomplimentary to black people when I was not the president, not the provost, not the this, where I was in a powerless position. First of all, women still often are the victims of something like that, and I know that to be true. But for me, I would most often act like I didn't hear it. So you and I could be talking right now and so on, and then this person says something that's completely inappropriate, and I would act like they didn't say it. They say, can't George right here? I'm not going to dignify it. I will not allow, I'm just not going to let people have me demonstrate anger on my part. There's a way that I had to learn to get through, that other people cannot control my behavior. So I've heard people make derogatory things. As a scholar, I took a lot of classes where they said things about slavery being mild or slavery being this, that I hadn't read enough books to really dispute. It just didn't make sense to me that a person would rather be a slave than free. But I just would not allow other people to control my behavior. And so, again, that probably doesn't answer the question or anything. But I think I could go to a program and listen and articulate an argument against those kind of programs. Yes. Maybe you should bring the microphone.
So you mentioned going to Germany and visiting those camps and seeing that for yourself. And you went that first time and you concluded something important is remembrance. You could have stopped there. Why do you keep going back?
Well, because first of all, because I was a scholar of race in America, I really wanted to learn about as much as I could about that so I could really do that. And so on numerous occasions, I've given presentations talking about what the Jewish experience means to me, a person who's not Jewish, and so forth. Or maybe this sounds corny to you all. I tell you what, I'm just being honest. You know what? I grew up just thinking black folk were the only folk who were discriminated against or disliked and all those other things. And so for me, to learn about other groups of people just helped put it into a context for me. So like right now, I'm going to write a book that's a comparative study of racial prejudice and so forth. I'm going to look at Canada. I'm looking at Australia. I'm looking at Brazil. I'm looking at Europe. I'm looking at South Africa. I've already been to those places and done a certain amount of the thing. I find it interesting. Someone mentioned earlier today about reparations and all of that. You know, in Australia in 2008, they did an apology to the Aborigine people. We have never, take your president, whichever president you want. And one of my colleagues there, they said it didn't matter to him, he didn't trust him. But any American president since the Civil War, none of them have issued an apology for slavery. But my point is, I just have to go and see those things. And so going to the Holocaust places and so forth is just very, very important for my wife and me. In that regard. Also, again, growing up in a society that was male-dominated has meant for me, I've had to spend a lot of my adult life really understanding the ways that in the environment that I feel most comfortable in has not been fair to women. You see, the universities that I taught at, University of Kentucky, Duke University, University of Texas, at some point they could not deny that they had been unfair to blacks, but they could all justify why women were not treated the same at those institutions. Well, I've had to undo all of those things about injustices to women. When I was a college president, everywhere I went, this is more than you asked for, I made sure that there was no such thing as a consensual relationship in the folk that I worked in. I told folk, since I was president, I couldn't have a relationship with anybody at that school. It was designed to protect women because women have been involved in so many quote unquote consensual relationships with unequals in that regard. So those are all things that, to me, come out of the black experience, but broaden it to other groups. But the Jewish experience is very, very important to me. Yes, someone else.
Hello. I wanted to ask, what would you say to somebody of a younger generation that says that your whole talk is constitutional betrayal and constitutional redemption? What if they say that by 1964 that the Constitution hadn't redeemed itself, or that the Constitution has, since 1964, has betrayed us again, or betrayed African Americans, women, or whatever minority or disenfranchised group or whatever? What would you say to them? Would you say, no, there's ways in which we can redeem it again, or no, it's still on its redeeming journey?
Okay. One of my, you know what, and I apologize, maybe all the other speakers said it in another way. Bill Thoreau, but I'll say it the way my colleague Bill Thoreau, in talking about our first class, where we talk about England and the United States looking at slavery and so forth. Bill Thoreau says they take a step forward, then a half step back. And if you look at what happened to the folk in Reconstruction, you take a step forward and you go back. And that may be, and several people alluded to some of that today, that everything still has to be challenged in that regard. But my point is, and maybe what I thought you was going to say, you're too optimistic, George Wright. And I'm okay with folks saying it, but I'm just saying if you understand what the nadir period was like, that you could be lynched for no reason at all, that's not the case today. So ironically, that is progress. You see, I didn't say it was perfect, but it is progress. That now things, while not completely fair, they are moving in the right direction. And it's up to us, and that's why I was saying that then, what are we doing to make sure things continue? I think you just cannot be defeated by whatever things happen. You know what? If you tell me you could tell from my conversation what my political orientation is, I say, wow, you better than me. I don't know what my political orientation is. But what I tell folks, don't the pendulum swing? Haven't we seen these things before? Now, I'm at an age where things may not change in my lifetime, but does everything have to change in my lifetime in that regard? Think about the folk who invested in me. They didn't get to see all the things from the civil rights movement. So I'm willing to believe things are going to be better for my grandchildren, comma, if my son gets married and never has any kids, unquote, in that regard, right? Okay. Or your children. He's engaged and they're supposed to get married in June, so maybe I'll get there. All right. But nevertheless, that's what I believe. So if you're going to, the one thing, did I not say earlier that the NAACP held a strategy meeting in 1929, and it's 1954 before Brown is passed. Then a year later, the court chips away at Brown, right? Thurgood Marshall called Brown to a tremendous setback because he said to the court, give us a date, January the 1st, 1960. Every school in America has to be integrated, whatever date. The court said with all deliberate speed. So with all deliberate speed, there are some places in America that have never integrated their schools. You see? But others have. So that's how you have to, it's a step forward and step back. You know what? A few years ago when they were saying that these DEI programs are discriminating against white folk, and and folk contact the University of Kentucky because we have Black History Month, Women's History Month, we have this. They said, when is White History Month? I said, Lord, I thought they knew all the other 8 months was White History Month. We just don't call them White History. Come on, y'all. I said, why are you all doing it? We took February, the shortest month, right? Geez, we do a few little programs here and there. Then they said, and somebody said, a legislator said, that how can she send her son to the University of Kentucky because doing homecoming week, we had a program in honor of Lyman Johnson, the one black person. She said, what about programs for her son? I said, I thought UK had 300 programs. They just don't call them white programs for homecoming. They call the one black program, right? Maybe so how can Lyman Johnson, a program for him, somehow be threatening to white folk? You see, one step forward, a step back. But that's how the women understand that everything has to be contested and contested again. I don't want to hold folk over, and especially one of the things I've learned, if your university's like mine, folk want to say, what is a typical college student? They want to say someone's 17 to 20. I wish I could meet someone 17. The students I have, they work a job or 2 jobs. They got this and that and all those other things. So if any of you have to leave, I fully understand the other responsibilities you have. Okay. But if there's another, I don't want to leave behind any question. Yes.
You gave a bunch of examples about constitutional betrayal, but how, in your own words, would you define constitutional betrayal?
Constitutional betrayal or redemption?
Betrayal.
Okay.
Define the term.
Constitutional betrayal. Yeah. It would be when the Constitution, it's not living up to equal rights or equal opportunities and things like that for all folks. The Plessy decision, the Williams versus Mississippi decision, the proliferation of Jim Crow laws that are upheld in that regard, but consistently, not doing anything about the people who victimized other folk. I didn't even go into what would happen when a white person is arrested for murdering or harming a black person, and the reality would be very little or nothing in that regard. Yes.
So for you, the Constitution isn't the problem, the faulty interpretation.
Well, you know what? It's maybe, and again, this was said earlier today, maybe there's nothing wrong with our laws. It's the way people are. In that regard. You know what? I wish I could say it quite right. I read somewhere where Thurgood Marshall said that if we could just change the law, and that's why they push so hard for the Brown decision and all that, then we will not have a problem. You see, the problem is just living up to that. But this white scholar in assessing them said that in some ways Thurgood Marshall and them were naive. It's not the law, it's the people and how their willingness to interpret the law and so forth, or to adhere to the law in that regard. You know what? Again, I try to stay away as much as I can from some of the things that's going on today, but in most places, after the death of George Floyd, if not already in place, universities started diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. Well, now in most of the states, Kentucky being one of my university, those programs have been dismantled. And I said as a member of the president's cabinet, whether I like that or not is irrelevant. I'm going to live up not only to the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. That you see on the other side, after Brown and things like that, people would not, number one, probably live up to the letter, but they would find other ways not to do it. So at Kentucky, we really are no longer having any program that has a race or gender or other kind of thing there. Because if that's what the legislature, if that's what our state has said, we have to do that. That's the spirit of the law. And I think that's what I'm supposed to do. I don't have to personally be in favor of something, but as a citizen, I've got to do what our society says we're going to do.
I think that's a great place to end. Let me thank you very
Okay.
much.
All right.
And let's